The year was 1959, and the oceans had gone quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet. A kind of quiet that comes before a calamity. Since the USS Nautilus bent the rules of naval warfare with nuclear propulsion, the deep ocean had shifted from a battlefield of endurance to a battlefield of speed. And in that new battlefield, the United States believed it was untouchable. Until the rumors started. Rumors of a Soviet submarine so fast, American sonar operators called it the Phantom. Fleet intelligence officers described blurry hydrophone signatures, spikes of acceleration no diesel engine could produce, no nuclear plant should survive. Admiral Arleigh Burke listened to the reports piling on his desk and finally snapped. If they can outrun our torpedoes, we lose the ocean overnight. In the late 1950s, fear wasn't an emotion, it was a policy driver. Meetings went dark, projects went off the books, and deep inside the Pentagon, a proposal formed. Not for a new torpedo, not for a new reactor, but for something far more dangerous. Push an American nuclear submarine beyond the limits of physics, and hope it didn't tear itself, and its crew, apart. Next episode. The plan that broke every rule Rickover ever wrote. The proposal landed on Admiral Rickover's desk like a bomb. A small group of Navy engineers, brilliant, reckless, terrified of Soviet progress, suggested something so unthinkable it wasn't typed. It was handwritten, with no signatures. Their idea: don't build a new submarine. Instead, force an existing nuclear reactor to run far beyond safe limits. Strip away safety interlocks, override control rods, let the core burn hotter, the turbines scream louder, and the submarine accelerate to speeds physics never intended. Rickover reportedly stared at the paper, silent, then said, "This is not engineering, this is Russian roulette." But the panic in the upper ranks was stronger than his objection. A codename was assigned, Nautilus's Edge, or simply, the Edge. The goal was seductively simple: outrun any torpedo on Earth, outsprint any Soviet submarine, hide behind speed itself, and for that, they needed a testbed submarine. One that could be sacrificed. One whose name would never appear in records. They chose a Skipjack-class attack submarine. Unofficially, the crew called her USS Achilles. Next episode. The refit that turned Achilles into a controlled bomb. At Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, under layers of compartmentalized codenames, the refit began. On the surface, the Achilles still looked like every other sleek, teardrop skipjack. But inside it was a weapon aimed not at the Soviets, but at physics itself. Modifications included rod override panels capable of yanking control rods out faster than any regulation allowed. Reinforced steam lines designed to survive pressures that bordered on explosive. Experimental acoustic dampeners meant to suppress the roar of a submarine breaking its own hydrodynamic limits. One engineer refused to sign the final inspection sheet. He simply wrote 2 words. Not safe. But the Navy didn't want safe. It wanted fast. The crew was handpicked, silent, loyal, and unnervingly calm. Commander Michael Vance told them only what they needed to know, which was almost nothing. But the moment they saw the unfamiliar wiring, the bypass switches, the emergency thermal alarms, they understood. They were aboard a ship that could kill them faster than any Soviet torpedo. And yet, they stayed. Next episode. The terrifying first trials of the Edge. The first Edge trials took place in a lonely patch of the western Atlantic. Each run followed a ritual that would make any reactor engineer recoil. Lock down the ship, retract rods, engage bypasses, ignore every alarm screaming to stop. The reactor surged. Turbines wailed like a steel beast in agony. Achilles tore through the depths at speeds sonar techs had never recorded. Inside, temperatures spiked unpredictably. Pressure gauges jittered in ways no engineer could fully explain. Dr. Richard Sterling, the physicist on board, wrote in his personal log. Thermal transients inconsistent. System response unpredictable. Achilles is balancing on a knife edge. But it worked. Achilles moved faster than any submarine in history. And faster than any torpedo. One more test remained. The Navy wanted the impossible. A full hour at maximum burn. The red line sprint. Next episode. The day Achilles challenged physics. And lost. Late summer. Off Puerto Rico. Achilles descended into the deep trench. Silent, steady, unaware of the fate waiting for her. Commander Vance stood behind the reactor operators. Calm, focused, probably terrified. Execute the Edge protocol. The rods snapped back. The reactor roared like a caged star. Achilles surged forward, faster, until the numbers stopped making sense. 30 minutes in, the crew had achieved the impossible. The submarine was moving at a speed the Navy would later classify so deeply it might as well have been erased. Then, at minute 32, reality snapped. A critical seal in the primary coolant loop gave way under stress no engineer ever believed it would face. Coolant flashed to steam. Pressure collapsed. The reactor spiked into the red. One crewman shouted, "Loop pressure falling." Another, "Uncontrolled power rise." Then the explosion hit. A massive steam rupture ripped through the compartment. The submarine lurched. Lights flickered. Achilles pitched downward into an uncontrolled dive, straight toward crush depth. In the reactor room, men died instantly. Others were burned or fatally irradiated as they fought to engage manual cooling. Vance barked orders through the smoke and chaos. They fought the dive. They fought physics. They fought death. Finally, 300 feet before the hull would implode, they stopped the descent. Achilles floated. Barely. She was alive. Her crew, not all. Next episode. The cover-up that buried Achilles and erased her from history. The U.S. Navy moved swiftly. Achilles was recovered in total secrecy, towed under the pretext of a routine training exercise. The dead were quietly buried under falsified incident reports. The survivors, irradiated, shaken, traumatized, were isolated, medically classified, and then released with generous pensions and brutal non-disclosure agreements. Everything else disappeared. Logs, schematics, reactor data, personal journals, even the codename, the Edge, all buried under a classification so deep it was officially non-existent. The submarine's hull was stripped, repurposed, and ultimately scrapped. The reactor was dismantled and sealed away in a secure facility. Commander Vance retired within a year. He never spoke publicly about Achilles again. The project meant to break physics had proven a darker truth. When you push too far, the ocean, and the atom, push back harder. Achilles never entered the history books. It became a ghost of the Cold War, erased, forgotten. Except by the men who survived. And by the files locked in vaults that will likely never be opened. Following the near disaster of the USS Achilles and the burial of Project Nautilus's Edge, the U.S. Navy faced an uncomfortable truth. The core problem posed by the Soviet, Phantom submarine, had not been solved. Yet the Navy could not admit how close the Achilles had come to triggering a nuclear catastrophe. Instead of abandoning the pursuit of extreme underwater speed, the Navy, driven by Cold War paranoia and fear of Soviet dominance, quietly repackaged the project under a new, harmless-sounding title, Project Deep Current. The name suggested routine oceanographic research, not high-speed nuclear risk. It was buried deep in the Naval Reactors Branch's budget, and only a handful of officers, led by Captain Elias Thorne, an unnervingly calm and fiercely loyal officer, were fully briefed on its true purpose and on the nightmare that had come before it. The core idea, thermal surging. Project Deep Current was built on the same reckless principle that had defined Nautilus's Edge, forcing a nuclear submarine's reactor to generate a deliberate surge of thermal energy, pushing the vessel to speeds no submarine had ever achieved. To grasp the danger, one must understand the physics of a naval nuclear reactor. Such reactors are designed with layers of redundancy to prevent a prompt critical event, a runaway chain reaction. In normal operation, the reactor produces heat, which turns water into steam, which drives the turbines. Everything exists in careful equilibrium. Deep current demanded intentionally breaking that equilibrium. The physics of the surge. Engineers planned to rapidly withdraw the control rods, the neutron-absorbing brakes, far past their safe limits. This would spike the reactor's thermal output, producing a powerful burst of superheated, high-pressure steam. The engineering gamble. Success depended on whether the submarine's systems could endure the strain. Could the coolant pumps move enough water to keep the core from overheating? Could the heat exchangers shed the intense load without boiling the coolant dry? Could the steam lines survive the sudden spike in pressure? No nuclear reactor had ever been pushed to these levels. Standard safety protocols capped the core at 100% of its maximum rating. Deep current aimed for between 130 and 150%. What engineers grimly called standing on a razor's edge. It was a journey into unknown physics driven by strategic desperation. And when you push a machine, especially a nuclear machine, into uncharted territory, that territory tends to push back. The Red Line Trial, the second experimental submarine, a Thresher-class vessel referred to here as the USS Stinger, was chosen for its larger size and somewhat stronger engineering. It was refitted in secret and ready by 1961. Its true name was redacted in most surviving documents. The location for the trial was a deep basin in the North Atlantic, far from traffic and prying ears. The autumn seas above were calm and gray, masking the chaos brewing 300 feet below the surface. Commander Alistair Graves, a stern, methodical officer who knew only fragments of what happened to the Achilles, was in command. He trusted his reactor crew completely. They were products of Admiral Rickover's merciless nuclear training program. Early promise. The initial phase of deep current shocked the engineers by working better than expected. Power ascending. The operators carefully eased the reactor past 100%. The new bypass systems, simplified and strengthened using lessons from the Achilles disaster, activated seamlessly. The surge. Thermal output climbed past 135%. The steam lines vibrated dangerously but held. The reduction gears held as they transferred the enormous power to the propeller shaft. Achieving the impossible, the Stinger shot forward. Graves watched numbers on his instruments that no submarine had ever reached. The acoustic dampeners held, muting the vibrations to manageable levels. For a few glorious minutes, the Stinger was everything the Pentagon dreamed of, the fastest, quietest submarine on Earth. The Navy engineers monitoring from a support ship miles away believed they had succeeded. The Phantom submarine problem was solved. The crash. Their triumph lasted only minutes. The first warning was subtle. A rising whine from the coolant pumps, a sound that only an experienced submariner would recognize. The alarms. Suddenly, the control room filled with mechanical and radiation alarms. The engineering officer stared in horror as reactor temperatures spiked. Cavitation. Extreme heat and speed caused cavitation inside the primary coolant pumps. Instead of water, the pumps were whipping air, steam bubbles created by low pressure and high velocity. With the pumps failing, the reactor was not being cooled. The runaway reaction. Temperatures skyrocketed. The reactor teetered on the brink of going critical. The Stinger hovered just seconds from a core breach, a massive steam explosion, or, in the absolute worst case, a sub-kiloton nuclear detonation underwater. The submarine was seconds away from becoming a radioactive tomb. The fight for survival. Commander Graves and his engineering crew fought back with extraordinary discipline. Manual scram. The automatic shutdown struggled against the pressure. The operators executed a manual scram, slamming the control rods into the core with explosive force. The runaway reaction slowed. Auxiliary pumps. The primary pumps were lost. The crew activated the tiny auxiliary cooling pumps, equipment never meant to cool a fully active reactor. Against all odds, they kept a trickle of cold water flowing. The core stabilized, but the Stinger was dying. Structural warping. The violent temperature swings warped major hull components. Internal bulkheads twisted. Engineers later determined that the structural integrity of the submarine had been permanently compromised. The Stinger was saved, but crippled beyond repair. Aftermath. Classified as an irregularity. The Stinger was surfaced, towed back in secrecy, and sealed off from all but the highest clearance personnel. The cover-up was even more thorough than that of the Achilles. The official story. Internally, the incident was labeled a Class A thermal excursion, the most serious category short of a meltdown. Externally, the Navy released a single paragraph to Congress, claiming an equipment irregularity during routine deep-sea operations had caused irreparable propulsion damage. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic misdirection. The fate of the vessel. The Stinger was decommissioned immediately. Its reactor removed and buried. Contaminated parts were sealed in concrete. The hull was scrapped in a remote yard, melted down so no outsider could ever study the warped metal. Silencing the witnesses. Graves and his reactor crew were interrogated, sworn to secrecy, and scattered throughout the fleet. They were told, under threat of treason charges, never to speak the words, "deep current," again. The USS Stinger, the experimental submarine that had nearly vaporized itself in the depths of the North Atlantic, was a crippled, radioactive hulk clinging precariously to the surface. Its return to port was not a heroic homecoming. It was a ghost-like procession managed by the highest levels of naval command who were desperate to keep the vessel's true state, and its terrifying mission, a secret. The operation to bring the damaged submarine home was codenamed Operation Ghost Ship. It began immediately after Commander Graves confirmed the reactor was stabilized, albeit severely damaged. Near total blackout procedures, the Stinger limped home under the tightest security protocols imaginable. All non-essential electronic systems were shut down. There were no routine radio transmissions, only encrypted, burst transmissions sent to a single, secure naval receiver at pre-arranged times. The crew was ordered to maintain radio silence, fearing any prolonged, open transmission could be intercepted by Soviet trawlers or listening posts, revealing the U.S. Navy had suffered a catastrophic failure in its nuclear program. The invisible escort. The wounded submarine was not granted a public, high-profile escort. Instead, it was secretly met miles out to sea by two highly specialized, unobtrusive salvage tenders that were operating under a false cover of cable-laying survey. These vessels provided the slow, steady tow needed to guide the Stinger back to the massive, secluded naval shipyard at Newport News, Virginia. The tug operation was conducted largely at night, avoiding major shipping lanes and the prying eyes of civilian vessels. No surface acknowledgement. From the moment the Stinger surfaced to the moment it entered the harbor, the U.S. Navy surface fleet acted as if the vessel did not exist. There was no surface acknowledgement from any passing ships, no welcoming salute, and no official communication. Just a vast, silent, and unnerving coordination of secrecy designed to make the 400-foot submarine vanish in plain sight. The cleanup and the unmarked suits. The moment the Stinger was safely maneuvered into a closed, high-security drydock at Newport News, the level of paranoia and physical security reached a frenzy. Immediate purge. Before the drydock could be drained, the base commander received a sealed, high-priority order. Anyone not specifically cleared for Project Deep Current, or the subsequent cleanup operation, was ordered to leave the shipyard immediately. Hundreds of civilian workers, mid-level officers, and standard maintenance crews were abruptly ushered out, told only that a highly sensitive prototype had arrived for maintenance. The radiation teams. The subsequent investigation was not run by standard Navy safety officers. The drydock was sealed under heavy canvas, and access was granted only to teams wearing unmarked, high-protection white suits, personnel drawn from the Naval Reactors Branch and the Atomic Energy Commission (AEC). These were not just maintenance teams. They were radiological experts assessing the full scope of the contamination caused by the steam explosion and the runaway fission reaction. Their primary task was twofold: measure the damage and, crucially, contain the radioactive secret. The classified shipment. The forensic investigation confirmed the engineers' worst fears. The reactor core was permanently warped, and several primary components, including the control rod drive mechanisms and sections of the main steam piping, were heavily contaminated and structurally compromised by the extreme thermal stress. These most sensitive, highly radioactive parts of the reactor assembly were surgically removed, triple-sealed in massive lead-lined crates, and shipped to a classified storage facility, likely the Hanford or Savannah River sites. These components, the physical evidence of the near meltdown, were never seen again in public records. They became the silent, radioactive testament to Project Deep Current's failure. The official statement issued to the press and the lower ranks of the Navy remained rigidly consistent: routine mechanical maintenance. A small, dull report of minor engine issues was logged. The truth, known only to the traumatized crew and the small circle of high command, was a terrifying one: a catastrophic near meltdown covered up within hours of the submarine reaching port. The fear was not just technical, it was political. The U.S. Navy could not allow the Soviets, or even the American public, to know how close they had come to detonating a nuclear reactor in the ocean for the sake of a few extra knots of speed. The successful burial of the USS Stinger and the erasure of Project Deep Current was not a single event. It was a sustained, decades-long campaign of bureaucratic denial. The Navy, under the iron fist of Admiral Rickover and his successors, understood that the greatest threat to their program was information, and they moved ruthlessly to neutralize it. For years afterward, the Navy insisted, with an almost chilling uniformity, that the experiment never happened. The altered records. The paper trail was meticulously destroyed or altered. Logbooks were amended to remove any entries referencing the high-output trials. Fuel consumption records, which would have clearly shown the massive surge of power output, were classified and then officially lost. Duty rosters disappeared, making it impossible to trace the full complement of the specialized engineering crew aboard the Stinger during its final voyage. The code of silence. The surviving crew members, the only witnesses to the terror, were the most difficult part of the cover-up. They were subjected to ongoing, subtle pressure. Crew members later reported being strongly encouraged to forget specific dates and locations, psychological coercion backed by the very real threat of losing their careers, their pensions, and their freedom if they broke their non-disclosure agreements. This created a generation of submariners who carried a secret that was too dangerous to speak aloud. The cracks in the wall. Despite the comprehensive nature of the cover-up, the weight of the secret was too heavy for a handful of men to carry indefinitely. Over the decades, fragments of the story leaked out, not in major exposé form, but as whispers and shadows in the periphery of military history. Anonymous letters. By the 1980s, historians and investigative journalists occasionally received anonymous, carefully typed letters detailing impossible speeds and reactor instabilities in early 1960s submarines, always signed by a concerned engineer or deep current survivor. While these letters lacked hard evidence, they confirmed the same narrative points: the extreme speed, the sudden pressure spike, the secret tow. Old engineering memos. During audits or archival reviews of related projects, a few researchers stumbled upon old, heavily redacted engineering memos referencing the need for improved thermal containment at 150% output, dated years before such output was officially possible. These documents served as cryptic breadcrumbs confirming the nature of the experiments. The quiet admissions. Most compellingly, a few retired, high-ranking officers began to speak, carefully and obliquely, in interviews given long after their security clearances had expired. They never named the ship or the project, but they hinted at the profound risks taken. "We were desperate to catch the Soviets," one admiral told a naval history publication in the 1990s. "And we pushed our engineers to do things that physics told us were unwise. Yes, one of our boats once came closer than anyone should to triggering an underwater nuclear event. That was the day we realized speed wasn't worth the price of the entire Atlantic ecosystem." The cover-up held. No major newspaper ever published a fully sourced, comprehensive account of the Stinger and Project Deep Current. The men who survived were silent heroes of an invisible war, and the Stinger remains officially an ordinary submarine that suffered a routine failure. But the myth lived on. It became an underground legend within the nuclear navy, a terrifying cautionary tale passed in hushed tones among engineering officers about the time the Navy raced a ghost, and nearly lost its soul to the depths. The failure of Deep Current saved the Navy from its own hubris, cementing the understanding that some technological frontiers are simply too dangerous to cross.